Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with the leaders and experts shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. I say a weekly conversation, but this is actually a special episode of this podcast because of what is unfolding right now in Washington, D.C. and around the world as we learn more about the extraordinary campaign in the Caribbean where American military forces have been attacking boats with civilians as part of what the Trump administration says is its effort to take on narco-terrorism. This has caught the public's attention, especially because of a really extraordinary situation where it turns out that the first of these boat attacks left wreckage in the high seas with two survivors clinging to the wreckage, and then the U.S. killed them. And the Washington Post reported first that this had all flowed from a directive by the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, to kill them all at the beginning of the engagement. There's been a lot of claims back and forth, a lot of finger pointing back and forth, and it is unfolding on Capitol Hill, where investigations are being demanded in the media and in the broader public. And the wider recognition that this is not just about one lurid example, but the entire policy and the way it fits into this pressure campaign being waged against Venezuela and much, much more. This is a teachable moment for all of us, and it's something we need to pay attention to and to act on as citizens. To help us understand here and now, right now, what's going on, what the law says, what we need to know, and what the stakes are, I'm really happy to be with Katherine Yon Ebright. She's one of my colleagues at the Brennan Center for Justice. She's a counsel in our Liberty and National Security program, and she is one of the country's leading experts on war powers and on emergency powers. And Katherine, thank you for joining us on short notice and letting us all know what you think is going on.
Yeah, so for the past several months, the Department of Defense has been undertaking a series of strikes on vessels, small boats in the Caribbean and East Pacific. The administration has been saying that these use of lethal weapons of war against these boats are part of a broader armed conflict with a series of gangs and cartels that operate in Latin America. But what these actually amount to are killings of civilians because, as I think we all know, and as our common sense tells us, there in fact is no war. And so it's a series of strikes killing around 100 people now, outside of war, without due process, without any clear legal basis. And I think it's remarkably concerning to have our military undertaking this kind of activity.
I've been really struck by how unanimous and how broad the response from legal experts are to this. Why is it wrong, though, to say that there's some kind of conflict with armed drug gangs? It's not an individual person here or there, but these are fairly organized operations. Why is that not enough?
Yeah, so legally speaking, war or armed conflict requires some sort of hostilities and struggles between armed, organized groups. That refers to groups that have some sort of military capacity, military structure. It's not, a club or an organization or even a network of loosely affiliated criminals. If you think about our war with Al-Qaeda, right, there was a specific command structure that existed for that group. For the Islamic State, there is a specific command structure that exists for that group. Those groups also literally declared war on the United States. And so, the opening salvo for Al-Qaeda was not actually 9/11, though obviously that was a very dramatic, high-scale, large-scale military in scale and effects type attack, right? The opening salvos actually were attacks on U.S. embassies, attacks on U.S. military bases that happened abroad in Africa and the Middle East. And so that organized armed group had been waging these hostilities or taking these attacks on US military objectives, on US political institutions for years. And then that escalated into a one-day attack that killed thousands of Americans, that also, in addition to hitting the Pentagon, or in addition to hitting the World Trade Center, hit the Pentagon, right? And so that is what, if you're talking about non-state actors, war looks like. It doesn't look like drug dealing. It doesn't look like narcotics trafficking. It doesn't even look like, low-scale gang violence, right? This, in fact, is stuff that happens every single day all across America, perpetrated by American citizens, right?
And so we have ways to stop drug. None of us are saying it's no problem for drugs to come into the country. Drugs do damage. Drugs damage lives. But we have many ways to stop drugs from being illegally imported into the United States, including working with foreign governments overseas, seizing boats, seizing contraband, making arrests, doing all those other kinds of things that a large part of the federal government is actually set up to do, just not sending the military to kind of blow things out of the water using the weapons of war and the machinery of war and ask questions later. Do we even know these facts? One of the things that's so striking is that we have social media posts, we have rhetorical statements like calling them narco-terrorists, but we really have not seen even an attempt by the administration to lay out what they're doing and why they think these particular boats are a particular danger or anything like that.
That's right. There has been not a tremendous amount of transparency on the supposed facts that the administration has, or the supposed law that it's invoking to justify this extraordinary use of the weapons of war against civilians. I think it would be helpful, though, to go back to something that you just mentioned, which is, how is the government usually undertaking efforts to prevent drugs from coming into the United States, right? And that is, as you suggested, these maritime interdictions where the Coast Guard, operating in a law enforcement capacity and sometimes with naval intelligence and naval backup, they do interdictions. So they stop those boats that they think may be engaged in drug smuggling on the high seas, and they board them and they look for the drugs. And if people, in fact, are narcotics trafficking, they then send them for prosecution, whether in the United States or in their home countries, right? And that's been done across administrations. It's uncontroversial, and it's lawful. It's not summarily executing people without knowing who they are, or summarily executing people for crimes where the death penalty isn't actually the criminal punishment. And one last thing on interdictions: about a quarter to a fifth of the time, the Coast Guard is wrong, and the supposed drug smuggling vessel that they've just stopped and boarded turns out to be fishermen, turns out to not be anyone affiliated with any criminal enterprise. And so when you're talking about dozens of strikes killing hundreds of people, right, how do we know that we're not just killing people who have no criminal record? I mean, whether they're criminals or fishermen, they're still civilians because they're not combatants. There is no war. But we could be killing completely random, totally innocent of any crime or wrongdoing people with this kind of policy, which is why we have a law enforcement structure that's around this, and why we don't use weapons of war, the tactics of war, outside of an actual armed conflict where there's an organization trying to kill Americans.
So now we've known that this has been going on for a few months. But as everybody knows, and we're having this conversation on a Friday morning, this has now exploded into a controversy because of one particular strike, which was, as I understand it, actually the first one in September, where there was a strike on a boat, and then there were survivors clinging to the ship, what was left of the ship, and then there was a decision made to kill those survivors. Or to attack that part of the boat. And the Washington Post had reported that in one way or another, this flowed from Secretary of Defense Hegseth saying, kill them all. And there's been a lot of finger pointing, a lot of lack of clarity from the administration about whether they were proud of what they did or denying that it ever happened, or both. But but this has blown it up into a huge thing. And I know that you think that, as bad as this is, it risks obscuring the legal status and the problems with all the other boat strikes that didn't involve targeting individuals clinging to a burning shard of wood on the seas.
Yeah, that's right. We have seen the language, quote, war crimes bandied about. War crimes can only take place in a war. They're violations of the law of war or law of armed conflict, which simply doesn't apply in this context because there is no war. And therefore, all of these strikes are murder. And this is like a murder on top of a preceding murder by like 45 minutes. And so it's all rank unlawfulness and illegality. But the reason that this has really, captured the discourse is that even if this were a war, even if the men on that first boat, and I think it would be maybe a stretch to say a ship, but the first boat, even if they had been combatants, the moment that they took that first strike and then they're shipwrecked and they're trying to cling to the remnants of this boat, the wreckage, they are protected under the law of war, and you can't take that second strike. In fact, the prohibition on targeting these kinds of survivors, targeting the shipwrecked instead of proffering assistance, that has existed for over a century. That has been in the Hague Convention that preceded the Geneva Conventions.
Well,
right?
You've reminded us that there was a German U-boat commander, Commander von Eck, who was executed by firing squad after World War II during the war crimes trials there for doing this very kind of thing. Because the ship is the danger, not the sailors. In contrast to, actually, there's different rules for land war. But the point you've made, this isn't a war. And it's so easy to sort of almost slip into that mind frame. The conservative columnist George F. Will the other day, in a very passionate denunciation of what's going on, said war crimes without a war, that's a first. but in some way that's kind of the moral territory that we're in. And so what laws would apply to this, and what kind of accountability, and who would be properly under those laws held accountable?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, because this is not a war crime, given that there's no war, it appears to be murder. We have criminal law that prohibits conspiracy to commit murder, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which all service members have to abide by, in addition to having to abide by sort of standard civilian criminal law. That prohibits murder. And so this is unlawful and a violation of criminal codes across the board. And I think that there is a real desperate need for investigation to understand who is responsible for these orders, who is responsible for this policy. It may not just be, of course, within the Department of Defense. There are individuals in the White House, including Stephen Miller, who have reportedly been very involved in crafting the strikes policy. And I think the investigation and the accountability really has to start at the top.
And since we're talking about domestic laws, we would say, as we would whenever talking about any crime, that these are allegations, I guess we would want to say, of murder, depending on how the facts play out. I mean, I guess the question is, people in the military are proud of the adherence to the rule of law that has built up really since Vietnam. It's one of the strengths of the American military. It's something that Pete Hegseth has disdained and scorned, and in his book, has kind of very much chafed at the idea that these pointy-headed lawyers are looking over the shoulders of the warriors making these decisions. But it's actually really the case that, especially with remote control war or remote control military operations, it is both possible but necessary to have certainty that the law is being followed. And that means there were lawyers in this process, or people who knew about the rule of law at the very least. Do we know that? Can we assume that? Is that a wrong assessment?
There have been lawyers at various steps of the development and implementation of the strikes policy. One of the things that happened over the summer was the Office of Legal Counsel within DOJ prepared and issued an opinion. It is classified. It's obviously not public yet, though we are working with partners on the Hill and in civil society to push for that opinion's release. And that opinion, it's my understanding that the production of it was quite irregular, that the analysis is not particularly persuasive, and that it relies on facts that are stated basically by fiat and without, some real basis in truth. And the opinion, it's been reported, concludes that we are in fact at war with these various gangs and cartels, and that their narcotics trafficking is an integral part of their way of prosecuting that war and funding the war that they're perpetrating against the United States and its partners.
You've called this kind of thing secret war, and in other settings, the idea that we have secret legal opinions saying, "Oh, this is all okay," that aren't actually made available to the public and often not even to Congress. And one of the things that's so striking with this is the lack of even an attempt at proving that this is a threat to the United States that needs this kind of action or all these other things. What we know is that, according to press reports, the intelligence agency said, no, the Venezuelan government didn't send these drug gangs into the United States to upend our country or to do what they're doing. And we also know that the admiral in charge of the Southern Command resigned. I believe today is the day his resignation takes effect, if I'm correct.
A week. I think it's a week from today.
A week from today. So he can still, go to the canteen and buy souvenirs or whatever. But there was news reporting within the last day that he was pushed out by Hegseth, by Secretary of Defense Hegseth, because he said, hey, this doesn't seem legal, what we're being asked to do. These are all the kinds of things that raise the question of where accountability, not just how accountability, but where accountability should happen. There's a bad track record in our country that when things go wrong, it's the people at the bottom of the chain, the people who don't really have as much ability to turn down an order or to do an analysis if an order is legal or not. They're the ones who get held accountable. And it's rare that there's accountability among the higher-ups. Are you worried about that?
I am a little bit worried that we'll see a repeat of how Abu Ghraib, some of the most serious and notorious war crimes of the Iraq War, was handled in the aftermath.
Remind us what that was.
So there was a prison, Abu Ghraib, that had been operated by U.S. forces in Iraq, and it was disclosed that torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading practices were undertaken by U.S. service members against Iraqi prisoners. And there were photographs, videos, just really horrific documentation of these abuses. And it was the lower level service members who were the only ones held to account. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have been prosecuted. The ones who were prosecuted very much were responsible for those acts of torture and other abuses. But the higher ups weren't held to account in any meaningful way. It was like a higher up would be demoted, but not criminally prosecuted.
And this too is a lot more, you don't expect really the sailors on a boat to have that much discretion about when they're given an order to attack this, attack that. The Abu Ghraib was even more the product of a broad policy. I mean, this is a challenging situation where there needs to be accountability. And I want to talk about how that kind of accountability can happen. You've argued and suggested, and we've argued to the world that Congress really has the key role stepping up here in terms of oversight, accountability, and disclosure. We know these boats are. We know the U.S. forces are out there attacking these civilians, attacking these boats. We don't know the legal rationale, but more than that, we don't know the basis for this. We have a lot of rhetorical language about narco-terrorism, but not the kinds of things that you would seriously have for something of this nature. And Congress needs to step up. The key missing piece on this, as on a lot of other things, has been Congress has not played its proper role in our government as the central body of our democracy, but certainly holding the executive branch accountable. There are hints, there are tremors that there may be some changes here. There do seem to be more willingness on the part of people from both parties to actually look into this, but it isn't there yet. And part of the point you've made is that it has to be done in public. It can't be done in classified briefings, maybe not even within the existing committee structure. One of the things that happened this week, and I think it was in the House, was there was classified briefing, and the Republican members came out and said, oh, it turns out there was no problem after all. And the Democratic members came out and said, this is the worst thing we've ever seen. And the public has no way of judging. We've argued, and you were the first to suggest this, that there be a select committee that goes beyond even the Armed Services Committee or the other committees that are looking into this. Why is a select committee a good idea, and what is a select committee?
Yeah, so I want to reel us back a little bit to what is happening in terms of congressional oversight and why oversight is needed and how it can be conducted, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say that all of the oversight here has to happen in public view, right? There are classified orders here, there are classified rules of engagement, and I think Congress needs to look at those orders, the rules of engagement, to figure out, okay, is it safe for us to declassify this? Is there some risk? And so there is a place for classified review of, where exactly military units are being positioned, what operations aren't underway, right? But anything that is not going to jeopardize the national security needs to, in the short term, be released on this. But I'm not calling for, irresponsible release of classified information that's going to put service members who are in Southern Command in harm's way.
That's good to know.
So when we talk about what Congress is doing, there have been some bipartisan pushes for more transparency on the orders, more transparency to the Congress, more transparency to Congress and the public on the legal analyses that undergird this policy. And I think we are marching toward a place where hopefully we do get that information to lawmakers and eventually to the public when, again, it's safe.
And which lawmakers have been the most effective or the most out there in pushing for this kind of thing?
I would say that in terms of pushing for transparency on the legal analysis, it's probably Senator Kaine, maybe also Senator Paul in their pushes to rein in these congressionally unauthorized, unlawful hostilities.
That's Senator Tim Kaine, the Democrat from Virginia.
Yes, from Virginia. And then
Rand Paul, Republican from
Rand Paul.
Kentucky.
And then in terms of pushing for more transparency, it's really been the leaders of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees who themselves, as lawmakers who are supposed to have access to all of this information, legally are entitled to it. They've not been provided with some of the most foundational, basic information about these operations. And so they've sent repeated letters. They've criticized noncompliance with laws that require transparency. And I'm hoping that, at some point in the near future, they'll be ready to take the next step if that compliance isn't forthcoming, such as by subpoenaing some of the information that's currently being unlawfully withheld from the Congress.
And are they asking just about the double tap strike or about the whole thing?
About the whole thing.
And this is a breaking of the ice flows in a way on what has driven so many of us up the wall for the last year, which is Congress utterly abdicating in many, many realms its role vis-a-vis the executive. It's been supine, and that has been the central fact in a lot of ways, giving a lot of power to the president and even to the Supreme Court. And it didn't start with this Congress. Congress has we had Yuval Levin, the conservative scholar, on last week, who basically said that Congress is supposed to be the central branch on many things, but has turned into kind of a cheering or booing section for whoever the president is based on political party. And we want Congress to act like Congress. And the Armed Services Committee has more of a tradition of bipartisan work. It's kind of mind-blowing that they would get stiff-armed in that way, but they need to show some courage here, I guess.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see that, and of course would like to see more of it. To bring us back to this idea of a select committee, though, it can't just be the Armed Services Committee's pushing here, right? So I talked earlier about the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice, which had blessed the supposed legality of this policy. The Department of Justice is overseen by the judiciary committees. The decision on whether or not to undertake hostilities in the first instance, as opposed to the nitty-gritty of how military operations are undertaken, that jurisdiction falls in foreign affairs and foreign relations. And so those committees, House Foreign Affairs and Senate Foreign Relations, also have a stake in this, which means that if you just have an investigation that lives within armed services, you're going to be missing large parts of the puzzle, and you're not going to understand how is all of this happening, and then what accountability needs to follow, and how can we make our systems, how can we make our rule of law stronger so that we're not going to, in the future, irrespective of who the president is, have a policy of killing civilians. How can we ensure that this can never happen again? And that's going to require, I think, a concerted review that cuts across these different committees, that's fairly resource intensive, and that then ultimately will result in some sort of policy prescription, potentially recommendations for prosecutions, criminal prosecutions for various officials who've been involved with this policy. And I think that kind of thorough cross-cutting investigation very likely falls outside the capacity of any one institution that currently exists in Congress. And so the House or the Senate, without a presidential signature, could stand up that kind of committee, a select committee, to do an investigation that meets that broader scope and proposes these kinds of reforms and accountability.
And your point that it doesn't need a presidential signature, congressional consiglienti know that, but that actually is a noteworthy thing to a lot of people who aren't as focused on this. Congress has the power to do what it does all on its own. And this is unfolding, of course, not only in the seas of the Caribbean, but at a time when the administration is also ramping up pressure toward potential military action on the sovereign country of Venezuela with no congressional authorization, and has abused war powers within our own borders by using a wartime statute, the Alien Enemies Act, to detain and deport Venezuelans without due process. And this, as you, of course, know, because you've written about it so much, this was a wartime law that was only used previously during the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II, and is now being used for this purpose. And again, there's both the kind of the details of what happened, the legal basis, but then the broader context. That's actually really a big part of this. And the question that a lot of people probably have is, oh, come on, this Congress is going to do a big investigation of this president? It's controlled by the same party. Who are we kidding? And that sort of thing. And history actually has some encouraging answers there, I believe, in that this idea of a select committee, a special committee set up just to do this. There's a long history of this, and these are some of the best known and best moments of Congress over the past century. Harry Truman headed a special committee. He was, of course, a Democrat, a senator from Missouri, and he investigated defense contracting and the activities of the Roosevelt administration and did such a good job that Roosevelt made him the vice president, and then very quickly he was president. The January 6th committee, more recently, was bipartisan. You had the Watergate committee in 1973, which was at a time when Democrats controlled the Congress, but it was really run in a strikingly bipartisan way, so that it was the Republicans who revealed the existence of the taping system in the Oval Office. That eventually, soon thereafter, brought down Richard Nixon. There are other examples as well, and examples of where it doesn't work as well. There's ways to do it right and ways to not do it right. But these kind of investigations can focus people's attention, can ask broader questions, as you say, can deal with balkanized jurisdictions or lack of resources. And if it doesn't happen now, it's very possible that a year from now, a different party will hold the gavel in one or both of the houses of Congress. The voters will decide that in the election. And so this is one of the things we've been urging, but it isn't the only thing, and Congress can't wait for that. A broader final question. How do you see this playing out? This has exploded in a way that 2 weeks ago, we would not be having this conversation, and everybody would be following along, knowing so many of the ins and outs. How do you see this unfolding, and how do we keep people's eye not just on the details of this video feed or that conversation, but the bigger picture?
I think it's really hard to say where exactly this is going. My concern, of course, is that with the massive military buildup in the Caribbean, it's going to a place of a new regime change war in Venezuela that's not been authorized by the Congress, that doesn't have a democratic mandate behind it, but that, democratic accountability, public accountability will be very hard to establish and move, at least until, there's a shakeup in our political system. And so that's my worst fear. My best hope is that we are going to move toward more bipartisan scrutiny of this particular policy, more calls for transparency, and more frustration when those calls for transparency and compliance with the law aren't being met. And so I know that there has been some pretty sharp criticism of the leadership of Secretary of Defense Hegseth. I think to the extent that this unlawful policy continues, to the extent that he continues stonewalling Congress when it's trying to conduct oversight, that criticism needs to keep up. It needs to increase, because I think one of the most dangerous things, one of the things that the founding generation was terrified of, and that I think we all still should be terrified of, is an unaccountable military. Mm-hmm. And so I just think it's incumbent on members of the public, on lawmakers, to remain engaged on this, for members of the public, listeners of this podcast, to call your representatives.
The vast audience of the briefing.
Yes. Call your representatives, call your senators, tell them that this issue matters to you and that accountability is important here, and you'd like to see them engage in this Congress and potentially in future Congresses to prevent this kind of policy from recurring. And I do want to pick up, Michael, on one thing that you mentioned, because I think it really has sort of fallen out of the conversation, or maybe it never was part of a mainstreamed conversation, which is the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, this wartime law that back in March, Trump invoked to round up Venezuelan immigrants and deport them to a notorious prison in El Salvador, where we now have evidence that they were tortured. And, the courts have held up that Alien Enemies Act policy for the past several months. And of course, we are involved in that litigation, and we are hoping that the courts ultimately strike down the invocation. The Supreme Court ultimately strikes down that invocation once and for all. But one of the courts where we had filed a brief in support of a case brought by ACLU that court struck down the invocation in a sort of intermediate level and said, there's no war, and therefore you can't invoke this law to target Venezuelan immigrants in the United States. That opinion was released on September 2nd. The strikes policy began on September 2nd, right? And so when we talk about investigation, when we talk about accountability on the abuse of wartime authorities, it's not just this strikes policy as some sort of, hermetically sealed off from other administration policies issue. It's also the Alien Enemies Act and how that has facilitated literally the torture of over 100 men on this administration's and perhaps again Stephen Miller's direction. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that I'm very hopeful that this kind of investigative mechanism gets off, whether in this particular Congress in this year or the coming year, or in the next Congress if the gavel swaps.
They say that conscience is the idea that someone somewhere might be watching. And people who are engaged in these kinds of activities right now need to know there will be accountability, and act accordingly. And as you know, we at the Brennan Center, we don't do foreign policy, but we do the rule of law. We work to uphold the Constitution. We work to encourage checks and balances and the ways the Constitution designed to keep us free. This is a big moment in that effort. And thank you, Katherine, for teaching all of us about this. Thank you for being ahead of so many of us on this. And we will keep pushing, and we will keep all of you posted on how this goes and how this unfolds in what is both a scandal and a major public issue going forward. Thanks so much for being with us. And for those of you who found this useful, I will say, not to change the mood too much, that you can let people know about this podcast. You can sign up and subscribe on forums such as Spotify and YouTube and Apple, and let people know what's going on.